take your bias binding strip you've prepared and then fold it over and sew along for, I would say, about 3 or 4 millimeters, quite thin. And then once you've done that, you want to cut back your seam allowances so that it's nice and slim, but not too slim, because actually what you leave standing is going to go into your rouleau loop to give it its nice round shape. I'm using a fabric turner which has a hook at the end, so what you want to do is hook in here and then just push over your fabric and it turns, and you can get very slim binding like this. Now I've got 2 loops, one in my contrast fabric and one slightly thicker here for the outside, and now I'm doing a slightly slimmer one for the inside fastening, which has a smaller button as well, so not so thick, nice and thin. And it's very, very easy. They're about £1.80 in the shop, so I would get myself one of those. The length depends on what you like, really, 4 to 5 centimeters. Now we can put those ruler loops onto the front. It's a good thing to do this now because it actually identifies which is the right side up, and so you can't get confused because the thicker one is obviously the side that goes over. So stitch them down first. Make sure that the seam side is facing up when you're sewing, so that it's facing down when it's finished. Check that your button fits. Take the other ruler loop, put it about a centimeter and a half below the edge of the fabric to allow for the seam allowance. Now we're going to bind our seams, side seams, and also the facings. So this is very, very simple. We're just going to iron over bias binding, and then one side is shorter than the other. So the shorter side is on the top and the longer side is underneath, so that when you're sewing you absolutely make certain that you catch what you're sewing underneath it. And here you can see how nicely that's catching it. It's very simple, and I think it looks really effective if you don't have a serger or overlocker. And now I've done those, I also do my facings. Remember when I told you to leave your patterns on? Now this is the first time they're going to come off, but I still leave them very close by so I don't make a mistake. So where you've got the round markings, that's not going to be the side you bind. You bind the opposite side to where you have your round markings. Now I've also bound these. I can put them away, but again I put a pin on so I don't get confused which one is which, and I'll put them away until I need them. Now you want to put your waistband onto the back. That is done by a centimeter seam allowance, again sewing from one end to the other. And this is going to form the tunnel for the elastic. Now put the loops so they're facing each other, and then get your facing patterns out, and we want to face the front, but we're not sewing all the way across. We're only sewing about 3 centimeters off the edge here, and we do the same on the other side. So I can get in easier later on. You'll see it, or if you've already watched the other video how to do the sailor one, then you're already familiar with that. Then iron the seam upwards, and at this point we can now put together our side seams. Have a slurp of coffee, nice break, good time for it. And again we have a centimeter seam allowance, and make sure that you actually do sew in that bend at the bottom. Some people sometimes where they come down to the hem they just go straight down, but you need that to allow the hem to turn up. Now mark that hem. It's 3 centimeters, isn't it? So 4 centimeters up is where I'm going to put my rickrack, and I mark it with pencil simply because it's so much easier and cheaper way of doing it. And actually I didn't have any tailor's chalk either, so so use what you have, it really doesn't matter. And then the rickrack is just placed right on top of that, and you can use a zigzag stitch to sew it on, or you can just straight stitch straight through the middle and then you put your next row of rickrack above that. And I first did this by eyesight, but then of course you do need to check that you've actually done it right. I think that's quite important. Don't think, oh yeah, it'll be all right, because I did 2 skirts, and the first one, obviously I didn't measure it, and it's really wonky, and if you look really close you can see it. This is the second one, and it came out much nicer. Then the third row of rickrack, we'll measure again, and up to you where you want to go. I did 8 centimeters all the way across, and that was it. I really like it. It's very sort of Eastern European looking. It's quite nice. Now we want to bind the hem and the facings, and because I had run out actually out of my heart bias binding, I had to use the blue stuff, and I used an embroidery stitch to fasten it on, and I think that's really effective, and I think I will do this again. Now we can put our facings on. At this point, you see you've got the little round markings there. They need to line up anyway, so you know you've got the right one. And then you want to sew the facings together first with a centimetre seam allowance. Now that might seem a little bit tight to you, and that's on purpose, because we're going to do some understitching in a minute, and that will bring round the front those extra 2 millimeters that are missing or seem to be missing at the moment. Once we've done that, you can top stitch it if you like. You don't have to actually, you could just leave it as is, and then you sew down the front, 1 centimetre seam allowance, and I'm also marking my 3 centimetre hem, because we're going to sew across that later, and this is a good time to mark it. And then you turn it inside out, and the next thing to do is of course to do some understitching so that your seam comes up really nice and flat. And I've done the understitching now, and I'm now going to just tuck this all in and sew across the top. Make sure that nothing can fold over, and just with 1 centimetre seam allowance go from the edge to the point that you've already sewn, close it. Then I would recommend that you actually cut back your seam allowances. I think that's always quite a good one, especially if you're using thick fabric. Do it on both sides, turn it, and you get a beautiful, beautiful corner. There you can see your ruler look just pops out. Isn't that nice? You can see the understitching, and it automatically now folds over really lovely. I've also understitched the facing on the inside, but you don't necessarily have to do that. And there's going to be my button. Right, now we can do the hem, and we've already marked 3 centimeters. So all you have to do now is fold over right where the understitching is. So just right into the crease there, and then we just sew across the 3 centimeters. And once you've done that, you can trim your seam allowance back, not all of it of course, just the facing, and then across. And when you turn that, you get a really nice corner again, really smooth, and no hand stitching involved, which I like. I like it fast. However, you do have to do the hem by hand. I suppose you could do it by sewing machine, but because the rickrack's already on there, I wouldn't do it on this one. If there wasn't no rickrack and there was hearts or something, I might stitch it through on the sewing machine. Next we need to do the tunnel for our elastic, and all we have to do here is sew in that sewing line that we've already got where we attach the waistband. You can see I've done that here, it just comes out right above the waistband. So we can now put our elastic in, and the rule of thumb is really that the elastic should be, if it's a thick fabric, about half the width of what you've got at the back. Or if it's a lighter fabric, you can take a little bit less. But what I really would do is put plenty of elastic in, and we are going to secure it to one side and pull it through, put it on your kid, see if it fits. If it doesn't fit, if it needs a bit more, pull a bit more before you finish off the skirt. So just put a safety pin into your elastic and then just push it through that gap, so there's no leaving a gap open or anything, which is why I like this design. Assembly really flows. So you leave 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters standing, and then you just sew in that seam line to secure your elastic. Pull it through now as much as you need. Check it, make sure that it actually fits, and then you just put a pin in there, take it to your sewing machine, and you do exactly the same. You sew in that stitching line again, and then you can just have a look at your skirt and check whether it's the right width. Looks very good to me. You can top stitch this. I didn't do that on this skirt because the fabric is too thick, and it would have taken all the elastication back out actually once you top stitch that. In fact, I did do that and I unpicked it, so I wouldn't recommend that if you have a thick fabric. Then you put your under button directly on that seam, and that's going to hold the inner button, the rouleau loop with a nice polka dot. And once that is on, you can just fold your skirt over and attach the outside button, and you can go all the way through. If you wanted to, you could put an under button under, but I haven't done that here. I don't think it is necessary unless you have got a wild child. And then all you have to do is do it up and your skirt's finished. So the pattern is available through my website, which takes you to a link to etsy.com. Thank you very much for watching.